picture this specific historical moment. It is the year 1066. The Norman fleet has just landed on the southern coast of England, bringing with it the man who will reshape European history forever, William the Conqueror. But before William can march to Hastings, before he can slaughter the Anglo-Saxon army and claim the English crown, he has a terrifying, deeply superstitious task to complete that historians rarely mention. According to a rare, fragmentary passage in the Icelandic sagas, William the Conqueror does not fear the living English armies half as much as he fears a dead man, a corpse that's been rotting in the ground for nearly 2 centuries. He orders his soldiers to locate a specific unmarked burial mound overlooking the sea. He forces them to dig, to break open the earth with picks and shovels until they find the decaying remains of a Viking warlord who died almost 200 years before William was even born. Then William orders something that seems insane. The corpse must be dragged out and burned to ash on a massive pyre. Why would a conquering general waste precious time desecrating ancient bones? Because legend held, and William believed, that as long as those specific bones remained in English ground, no foreign invader could ever successfully conquer England. The bones belonged to a man so terrifying that even his corpse was considered a weapon of mass destruction. This is not just a legend born of medieval superstition. It is a testament to the true story of Ivar the Boneless, a man whose very name made kingdoms tremble. Before we dive into this forgotten story of survival, suffering, and unprecedented conquest, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, smash that like button and subscribe to Maproom Battles for more epic historical content. Comment below, where are you listening from? I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the darkest chapters of the past. Now, let's strip away 2 centuries of myth and look at the blood-soaked reality to understand the monster who scared William the Conqueror 200 years after his death. We have to travel back to a wedding night in the early 9th century, a night that was supposed to be filled with passion and celebration, but was instead marked by a dark prophecy that would echo through European history. The parents are legends themselves, names you've probably heard. The ambitious Viking hero Ragnar Lothbrok, already famous for his raids on France and England, and the mystic shield maiden Aslag, daughter of the legendary Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. The sagas tell us that on their wedding night, Aslag warned her new husband with genuine fear in her voice. She told him explicitly that if they consummated their marriage too soon, if they did not wait the traditional 3 holy nights, the child conceived would be cursed by the gods. She warned specifically that the boy would be born without the structural integrity of a normal human being, that his bones would be soft as butter, useless as rotted wood. Ragnar, driven by wine and lust, and that particular male arrogance that assumes warnings don't apply to men of his stature, ignored her completely. He forced himself upon her that very night. And 9 months later, the prophecy screamed its way into the world in the form of a twisted, deformed infant. The child was named Ivar. But as the midwives examined the newborn, they physically recoiled in horror. His legs were twisted at unnatural angles, where there should have been sturdy bone providing structure and strength. There was only soft gristle and cartilage tissue that bent and compressed under the slightest pressure. In the brutal, unforgiving society of the Norsemen, where physical strength was not just a virtue, but an absolute requirement for survival. This baby should have been taken out to the forest that very night and left for the wolves to devour. It was the custom. Many considered it mercy. Why let a child suffer a lifetime of disability when death could be quick? A Viking who could not walk, could not fight. A Viking who could not fight was completely useless, a drain on resources, a mouth to feed that contributed nothing. But Ivar was not killed. Against all logic, against all tradition and custom, he was kept alive. Why? This is the first great mystery of his life, a question historians still debate. Perhaps his eyes, reportedly an unsettling pale blue that seemed to see through people, held a terrifying intelligence that stayed his father's hand. Or perhaps his survival was the first sign of his unparalleled capacity for cruelty, a refusal to die simply to spite the world that didn't want him. Modern medicine offers us a clinical name for his condition today: osteogenesis imperfecta, commonly called brittle bone disease. It is a genetic mutation that leaves the skeleton fragile as glass, the whites of the eyes tinted blue or gray, and the body in constant, agonizing pain. Every movement risks fracture. Every stumble could mean broken ribs. Imagine growing up in a culture that literally worships Thor's hammer and the warrior's battle axe, while your own body breaks under the weight of a wool blanket. Every movement is a calculated risk of fracture. Every rough play fight with your brothers is a potential death sentence. Yet Ivar did not just survive his childhood, he thrived in ways that defy belief. He realized very early, with a clarity that must have been terrifying to witness in a child, that if he could not be the strongest man in any room, he had to become the absolute smartest. And if he could not make men respect him through physical prowess, he would make them fear him so deeply, so viscerally, that they would willingly carry him on their shields into battle, treating him like a living god of war. The Boneless nickname was not an insult by the time he was done with England. It was a title of absolute horror. To understand how the monster was created, you must first understand the pack of alpha predators he ran with. Ivar did not grow up in isolation or pity. He was raised in the shadow of giants. His father was the most famous raider in Christendom, and his brothers were swiftly becoming legends in their own brutal right. You have likely heard their names if you know anything about Viking history. There was Bjorn Ironside, a man whose skin was supposedly impenetrable in battle, a physical juggernaut who would go on to raid the Mediterranean and terrorize Spain. There was Ubba, a hulking berserker who preferred the axe to conversation and solved most problems by splitting them in half. And there were Fitzurk and Sigurd Snake in the Eye, both formidable warriors in their own right. These were Ragnar Lothbrok's sons, a fraternity of alpha predators, born and bred for one singular purpose: war and conquest. In any other family, in any other time period, in any other culture, the disabled brother would have been the object of pity at best, cruelty at worst. He would have been the one left behind to tend the hearth and count supplies while the real men went Viking raiding, fighting, earning glory. But the sagas paint a very different, very disturbing picture of the power dynamic between these brothers. They didn't pity Ivar. They didn't mock him or diminish him. They deferred to him. They listened to him. They obeyed him. This is perhaps the most fascinating psychological puzzle of the entire Viking Age. Why would Bjorn Ironside, a man who could reportedly crush a horse's skull with his bare hands, listen to and obey the commands of a younger brother who had to be carried everywhere on a stretcher or special cart? The answer lies in the specific nature of Viking leadership culture. The Norsemen valued physical strength, yes, but they absolutely idolized wit, cunning, intelligence. They had a specific word for it, slager, meaning cunning, craftiness, the ability to see the trap before it springs, to anticipate your enemy's move 3 steps ahead. Ivar possessed a mind that was as sharp and cold as the North Sea in winter. While his brothers were learning to swing swords and throw spears in the training yard, Ivar was studying Hvatafl Viking chess, a complex strategy board game. He was learning how to manipulate pieces, how to sacrifice pawns to capture kings, how to think 5 moves ahead while your opponent is still celebrating his last move. He realized, with brutal clarity, that his brothers were potent weapons, but weapons need a skilled hand to wield them effectively. He became that hand. He positioned himself as the strategist, the tactician, the brain of the family operation. If Bjorn was pure muscle, Ivar was pure calculating intelligence. It was a symbiotic relationship born of necessity, but forged in blood and cruelty. Historical texts suggest that Ivar compensated for his physical immobility with terrifying upper body strength and genuine proficiency with the bow, one of the few weapons that did not require footwork or mobility. But his true weapon was never physical. It was his voice, his mind, his ability to manipulate. He developed a tongue that could incite berserker rage in his warriors, or talk a wealthy merchant out of his entire fortune through psychological manipulation. He learned that if he could not force men to obey him physically, he could manipulate them psychologically through fear, through respect for his intelligence, through making them believe he could see things they couldn't. He became a master of what we'd now call gaslighting and psychological intimidation, centuries before those terms existed. There is a chilling theory among modern historians and medical professionals regarding his condition. If Ivar truly suffered from a severe form of brittle bone disease, his entire life would have been a cycle of excruciating, unrelenting pain. Every single day was a battle against his own traitorous skeleton. Chronic pain fundamentally changes a person's psychology. It can strip away empathy. It can make you resent the healthy, the walking, the comfortable, everyone who takes their functioning bodies for granted. It is entirely possible that Ivar's legendary cruelty, his documented appetite for elaborate torture and theatrical executions, was a projection of his own internal agony. He wanted the world to feel what he felt every waking moment. He wanted to externalize his suffering, to make it visible. As the brothers grew into men and their reputations spread, their raiding parties began to systematically terrorize the coasts of France, Ireland, and England. But these were just practice runs, training exercises. They were merely sharpening their claws on soft targets. The true turning point of Ivar's life, the moment that would doom the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, arrived with devastating news from across the sea. It was news of their father's death, but it wasn't simply that Ragnar had died after a long, glorious life. It was how he had died, and who had killed him, that changed everything. The legend says that Ragnar Lothbrok, still raiding in his old age, was captured during a failed invasion of Northumbria by King Aella, a pious Christian king who saw Ragnar not as a fellow warrior deserving honorable execution, but as a pagan devil deserving humiliation. Ayala decided to execute the great Viking hero in a manner specifically designed to maximize suffering and dishonor. He had Ragnar thrown into a pit filled with venomous snake's adders that would bite repeatedly, injecting poison with each strike. As the vipers sank their fangs into his flesh again and again, Ragnar is said to have shouted a final defiant prophecy that would echo through history, how the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. When this news reached the sons of Ragnar, when they learned their father had died screaming in a snake pit, the reaction was explosive and immediate. The sagas describe it with vivid detail. Bjorn gripped his spear so tightly in rage that the wood grain left a permanent impression in his palm. Hvitserk was trimming his fingernails with a knife and cut right through to the bone without even flinching. So consumed was he with fury. But Ivar's reaction was different and far more terrifying. He did not rage. He did not scream or weep. He went absolutely quiet, still as death, while his brothers immediately wanted to launch a disorganized revenge raid to burn a few Northumbrian villages. Ivar saw something bigger, a strategic opportunity disguised as personal tragedy. He told them to wait, to not just gather a crew of a few hundred raiders, but to gather an army, a great heathen army, unlike anything Britain had ever seen. He argued with cold logic that the death of Ragnar Lothbrok was not a tragedy to mourn, it was a casus belli, a legal justification for total war. He didn't just want to kill King Ea in combat. He wanted to systematically dismantle the entire kingdom of Northumbria, to erase it from history. This was the precise moment when Ivar the Boneless truly took command of his family and changed from a raider into a general. He began sending out messengers to every Viking harbor in Scandinavia, from Denmark to Norway to the Swedish coast. He promised glory to warriors. He promised silver to mercenaries. But mostly, crucially, he promised land permanent settlement in rich English farmland. He was organizing the largest invasion force Britain had seen since the Romans, and he was doing it all from a sitting position, unable to stand. The piglets were not just grunting, they were sharpening their tusks for slaughter, and the old boar's death would be paid for in a river of royal blood. The year is 865. In the Christian reckoning, to the Anglo-Saxon monks scribbling in their candlelit scriptoriums, recording history for posterity, it must have felt like the biblical apocalypse had finally arrived. For decades, generations, even the Vikings had been a seasonal nuisance, like bad weather. Terrifying when they appeared, yes, but manageable and predictable. They came in the summer months, raided a coastal monastery for silver and relics, burned a few villages, captured some slaves, and vanished back into the mist before the autumn storms made sailing too dangerous. They were like a violent weather system. You endured it with prayer, rebuilt what was destroyed, and prepared for next year. But in 865, the weather pattern fundamentally changed. The storm didn't pass. It settled in and began to grow. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the primary historical record of the period, maintained by monks, shifts its tone dramatically in this year. It stops recording isolated Viking raids and instead records with obvious fear the arrival of a force it simply calls the Mysal Heathen, here the Great Heathen Army. This was not 3 ships of raiders looking for quick plunder. This was a coalition of hundreds of longships, carrying thousands of professional warriors. It was a floating city of leather armor, wood, and iron. And at its strategic helm sat Ivar the Boneless, carried on his custom battle cart. This is where Ivar's genius truly begins to shine, separating him completely from the brutish stereotype of a Viking warlord who just wants to burn and kill. If he were merely a savage, driven by emotion, he would have sailed his fleet directly to Northumbria to attack King Ea immediately. He would have let rage dictate his strategy. But Ivar was cold, calculating. He understood that an army of this unprecedented size, estimated between 3,000 to 5,000 professional warriors, had a fatal structural weakness: logistics. They needed constant food supplies. They needed a secure base of operations. And most importantly, they needed mobility, the ability to move faster than English armies could respond. So Ivar made a counterintuitive decision. He did not land his invasion force in Northumbria, his target. He landed further south in the Kingdom of East Anglia, catching everyone by surprise. Imagine the absolute terror of the East Anglian king Edmund when he looked out from his fortress and saw the horizon literally turn black with hundreds of Viking sails. But Ivar didn't immediately attack East Anglia with fire and sword. Instead, he sent formal envoys to negotiate. He made a demand that was completely unprecedented in Viking warfare, something no raider had ever asked for before. He didn't just want the traditional tribute of gold and silver. He wanted horses. Hundreds of horses. This was a strategic masterstroke that changed the entire nature of the invasion. Vikings were sailors and infantrymen by training and tradition. They were not cavalry. But Ivar understood with brilliant clarity that in England, with its distances and road network, to truly conquer the land, rather than just raid the coasts, you had to move faster than the news of your arrival. You needed to appear where you weren't expected before defenses could be organized. He essentially bullied and negotiated with King Edmund into supplying his invasion army with the mounts they needed to become a mobile striking force. King Edmund, thinking desperately that he was buying safety and peace for his kingdom and people, gave Ivar exactly what he needed to destroy Edmund's neighbors and eventually Edmund himself. It was a deal with the devil, and the devil always collects. Ivar wintered his entire army in East Anglia through 865 to 866, feeding them on English grain and livestock, resting his warriors, training them to fight from horseback, something that took months of practice. He was weaponizing one English kingdom's resources against the others. While he waited and prepared, Ivar's intelligence network, his spies were extremely busy gathering crucial information. This is a detail often completely overlooked in popular retellings. The Vikings had sophisticated, extensive intelligence networks. Ivar knew that Northumbria, his target for revenge, was in the middle of a destabilizing civil war. The usurper King Ea, the man who had killed Ragnar, was actively fighting the deposed king Osbert for control. The kingdom was divided, weakened, distracted. The timing couldn't be more perfect. In late 866, with perfect timing, Ivar gave the order. The Great Heathen Army broke camp. But they didn't sail north by sea as expected, they rode by land. A column of thousands of mounted Vikings thundered north along Roman roads. bypassing coastal defenses entirely, moving with a speed that the English had never experienced before from Viking raiders. They weren't heading for some coastal monastery or isolated village. They were heading directly for the jewel of northern England, the ancient city of York. York, called Eoforwic by the Saxons, was the ancient Roman capital of northern Britain. It was protected by crumbling but still formidable Roman walls built centuries earlier. Capturing it would send an unmistakable message: the Vikings were not raiders anymore. They were conquerors who intended to stay. Ivar timed the attack with cynical, calculated precision. He arrived at York's gates on November 1st, 866, All Saints' Day, one of the holiest days in the Christian calendar. The city's leaders and nobles were in the cathedral for religious services. The guards were likely celebrating or resting. The entire city was distracted by holiness when hell arrived at the gates. The Vikings stormed York with barely any organized resistance. They slaughtered the small garrison, seized the treasury, and occupied the Roman fortifications. Within hours, Northumbria's capital had fallen. Suddenly, the Northumbrians woke up to an absolute nightmare. Their capital city was gone, occupied by pagans. The civil war between Ea and Osbert suddenly seemed petty and irrelevant. Faced with national extinction, the two rival kings did the only rational thing they could. They stopped fighting each other and united their remaining forces. They pooled their armies and marched on York to dislodge the invaders. This was exactly the moment Ivar had been waiting for, planning for. He didn't just want to capture a city, he wanted to capture or kill both kings in one decisive battle. He used the Roman walls not just defensively, but as an elaborate trap. He allowed the English armies to approach. He allowed them to think they had a genuine chance of retaking their capital. The ensuing Battle of York in March 867 was an absolute catastrophe for the English. The sagas describe brutal, close-quarters slaughter in the narrow streets. The Vikings, fighting with their backs to walls they now controlled, decimated the Northumbrian relief force in a killing ground of their own design. In the chaos of brutal street fighting, King Osbert was cut down and killed. But for King Ea, the man who had personally thrown Ragnar into the snake pit, a far darker, more theatrical fate was deliberately reserved. The battle ended. The smoke cleared. The screaming died down to moans. And Ivar the Boneless, carried on his battle stretcher by his warriors, looked down at the captured King Aela, the man who had murdered his father. The military conquest was secured. York was firmly in Viking hands. Now, the true theater of cruelty, the psychological warfare, could begin. What happened next to King Ea is one of the most debated, most horrifying episodes in all of Viking history. The history books written by monks tell us simply that the battle was won and Ea died. But the Icelandic sagas, written down centuries later but based on oral traditions, tell us that for King Ea, the true horror was just beginning. History is often written by the victims, and in the case of the Viking Age, it was mostly written by traumatized Christian monks. And there is no chapter in their historical record more terrifying or more hotly debated by modern scholars than what allegedly happened to King Ea after his capture. The capture of Aela was not treated as a normal prisoner of war situation. For Ivar, this was a ritualistic necessity, a sacred duty to his father's memory. The sagas tell us that upon capturing the king alive, Ivar ordered the preparation of something called the blaudern, the blood eagle. If you're squeamish about anatomical horror, you might want to skip ahead, because if the accounts are even remotely true, this was one of the most anatomically creative forms of torture ever devised by human cruelty and religious fervor. The ritual allegedly went like this, in precise, methodical steps. Baeo was restrained face down, unable to move. First, an eagle with outstretched wings was carefully carved into his back with a sharp blade, but that was just the artistic opening. Then the executioner, some sources claim it was Ivar himself, directing from his stretcher, systematically hacked through the ribs near the spine, severing them one by one with an axe. The ribs were then physically bent outwards, cracked open like a pair of gruesome wings spreading. Finally, the executioner would reach into the open chest cavity and pull the victim's still functioning lungs out through the wounds, draping them over the broken ribs. As the dying man gasped desperately for his final breaths, the lungs would allegedly flutter and move, mimicking the movement of a bird's wings beating. To add final insult to this unimaginable injury, salt was rubbed into the gaping wound to increase the pain. It sounds like something from a modern horror movie. But did it actually happen? This brings us to the most heated, passionate debate in Viking studies. For centuries, medieval historians accepted the blood eagle as historical fact. It was the ultimate symbol of Viking barbarism, proof of their savage nature. However, modern scholars, particularly linguistic experts, have raised skeptical eyebrows. Linguist Roberta Frank argues that the blood eagle might be a literary misunderstanding, a mistranslation of vague poetic Norse stanzas that simply meant an eagle fed on his back, a metaphor for leaving a corpse on the battlefield, for carrion birds to peck at. Medical experts point out that the human body would go into fatal shock and die long before the ribs were fully opened. From a purely physiological standpoint, keeping a man conscious and alive long enough to see his lungs flutter is nearly impossible without modern life support and massive blood transfusions. But here is the powerful counterargument from other historians. The Vikings were a warrior people who believed deeply in the tangible, visible power of symbols and ritual. They had intimate anatomical knowledge from butchering thousands of animals and centuries of close-quarters blade combat. If Ivar wanted to make a statement that would echo through eternity, terrorizing future enemies, would he really settle for a simple beheading or hanging? Whether the blood eagle was a literal surgical procedure performed on a living man, or a terrified exaggeration by traumatized Christian monks who couldn't comprehend what they'd heard, the ultimate effect was identical. The rumor of it alone broke the spirit of the Anglo-Saxons. When word spread that the king of Northumbria had been turned into a breathing statue of gore, organized resistance in the north crumbled. Fear is a virus, and Ivar was patient zero. With Northumbria decapitated literally and politically, and the population terrorized, Ivar installed a puppet king named Egbert who would do exactly as commanded, and turned his calculating eyes southward. He was not finished. Northumbria had been personal vengeance for his father. The next target, the wealthy kingdom of Mercia, would be for profit. And the target after that, East Anglia, the kingdom that had supplied him horses, would be for sport and to send a message. The monster was moving south again, and this time he was coming for the king who had given him the horses in the first place. Thinking he'd bought peace, King Edmund of East Anglia thought he had purchased safety through cooperation. He was about to learn the hard lesson that you cannot negotiate with a wildfire you can only burn. If the death of King Ea was a deeply personal act of vengeance, the death of King Edmund was something far colder, more calculated. It was an act of pure political terrorism designed to send a message. After securing the north through terror, Ivar turned his gaze back to East Anglia, the very kingdom that had supplied him with horses just a few years prior. Enabling his conquest, King Edmund had made the fatal mistake that weak rulers always make. He thought he could buy safety from a predator through appeasement. He believed that a transaction with Ivar the Boneless was a binding contract between honorable parties. He was catastrophically wrong. To Ivar, those horses were never payment for peace. They were a down payment on the kingdom itself. And now he was coming to collect the rest of the debt with interest. In 869, the Great Heathen Army rode into East Anglia like a plague, systematically burning libraries, slaughtering monks, destroying churches. King Edmund, finally realizing that appeasement and cooperation had failed, gathered his courage and raised an army. He met the Vikings in open battle, but the East Anglians were farmers, priests, and poets forced into armor, fighting against hardened veterans who had spent the last 5 years systematically bathing in Anglo-Saxon blood. The battle was short and brutal. The defeat was total. Edmund was captured alive and brought before Ivar in a scene that has been immortalized in Christian hagiography as the ultimate martyrdom. This was not just a meeting of two kings. It was a collision of two completely incompatible worldviews. Edmund represented the pious, civilized Christian order, the belief that God protected the righteous. Ivar represented the chaotic, primal force of the Old Norse gods, the belief that strength and cunning, not prayer, determined survival. According to the chronicler Abbo of Fleury, writing a century later but drawing on older accounts, Ivar offered Edmund a stark choice designed to test the man's faith. Become a puppet king under Viking rule. Publicly renounce your Christian faith. Live in humiliation, or hold on to your God and die in agony. It was a test, a cruel experiment. Ivar was genuinely fascinated by the Christian obsession with martyrdom. He wanted to see if this king's white Christ could actually save him from Viking steel and Norse fury. Edmund refused to submit. He looked the monster directly in the eye and declared with absolute conviction that he would never serve a heathen lord, never renounce Christ. Ivar's response was to turn Edmund's death into a perverse, elaborate piece of performance art witnessed by hundreds. He ordered the king to be tied to a tree lashed so tightly he couldn't move. Then he ordered his archers to form a line, but with specific instructions. They were not to kill Edmund instantly with a merciful shot to the heart. They were ordered to shoot carefully, methodically, to pierce his arms, his legs, his shoulders, his sides, avoiding all vital organs. The chroniclers write that Edmund was shot with so many arrows that he resembled a hedgehog, his body literally bristling with wooden shafts, blood weeping from dozens of deliberately non-fatal wounds. Throughout this prolonged torture, which may have lasted hours, Edmund continued to call out loudly to Jesus, praying, refusing to curse his captors. This display of faith infuriated Ivar. The Viking warlord finally grew bored of the game, of the stubborn refusal to break. He ordered Edmund's head to be hacked off with an axe and thrown contemptuously into the dense brambles of the forest, denying the king a proper Christian burial. Legend says, and this is where history blends into miracle, that when Edmund's followers later went searching desperately for the severed head to give their king proper burial, they found it being guarded by a wolf, a beast of Odin protecting a saint of Christ. Whether you believe this miracle or dismiss it as medieval propaganda, the result was undeniable and long-lasting. King Edmund became Saint Edmund, the martyr, and his shrine at Bury Saint Edmunds became one of the holiest pilgrimage sites in England. But for Ivar, this execution was a victory of a different, more practical kind. He had proven publicly that the Christian God would not intervene to save his followers. He had now killed 2 of the 4 major kings of England in spectacular fashion. He had systematically dismantled the political structure of the entire island. He was no longer just the boneless, he was the kingmaker, the most powerful and feared man in Britain. Yet at the very height of his power, something strange happened that historians still puzzle over. Just as he held the throat of England in his hand, ready to squeeze, Ivar suddenly let go. He disappeared from the English historical records entirely. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle stops mentioning him. The scourge of the Saxons simply vanished into the mist. Where did he go? And why would a successful conqueror voluntarily walk away from his conquest at its peak? The answer lies across the Irish Sea, in a city that was rapidly becoming the dark heart of the Viking world, Dublin. When Ivar vanished from the English history books around 869 to 870, he didn't retire to a farm. He didn't retreat in defeat. He simply moved his strategic chessboard to a new, more profitable table, while the Anglo-Saxons were breathing sighs of relief, praying desperately that the devil had returned to hell. The Irish were about to learn his name and feel his presence. In the annals of Ulster, the primary historical record of medieval Ireland, a new powerful warlord appears in the records around this exact time. They call him Eamar, the Irish rendering of Ivar. For years, historians debated whether Ivar the Boneless and Eamar of Dublin were the same person or coincidentally similar names. Today, the scholarly consensus is overwhelming. They are one and the same man. The boneless conqueror had crossed the Irish Sea to claim a new throne and build a different kind of empire. But he didn't go to Ireland to farm or settle peacefully. He went there to build a commercial empire, and the primary currency of that empire was human lives, slavery. Ivar marched into Dublin, or Dublin, as it was known then, named after the Black Pool where the Vikings moored their longships permanently. In the 9th century, Dublin was not a city of stone cathedrals and paved streets. It was a gritty, muddy, fortified trading post that smelled constantly of salt water, tar, and human misery. It was the largest slave market in Western Europe, where captured people were bought and sold like livestock. Ivar reunited there with his ally Olaf the White, a Norse king who had established a profitable foothold in Ireland years earlier. Together they formed a dual monarchy that would terrorize the British Isles for decades. This phase of Ivar's life reveals the cold pragmatism behind the warrior legend. In England, he had been a destroyer, fueled by the emotional need to avenge his father and prove himself. In Ireland, he became a builder, fueled by pure greed and geopolitical ambition. He understood with brutal clarity that to maintain a large standing army indefinitely, you needed vast amounts of silver, and the easiest way to get silver was to capture people and sell them to Arab markets in the east. In 870, Ivar and Olaf launched a campaign that demonstrated Ivar's tactical genius had not dulled with age or success. They turned their ambitious eyes north to the kingdom of Strathclyde in what's now Scotland. Their target was the fortress of Alt Clut, known today as Dumbarton Rock. Dumbarton Rock is a geological beast, a massive volcanic plug rising straight out of the River Clyde. It was considered absolutely impregnable. For centuries, armies had smashed themselves against its sheer cliffs and failed. The Britons inside felt completely safe. They had the ultimate high ground. They had thick walls. They had supplies. But they hadn't faced Ivar. Ivar did not try to storm the rock with ladders and ropes. He knew that his men, and certainly he himself from his battle cart, could not scale those vertical cliffs under missile fire. That would be suicide. Instead, he laid siege with scientific patience. But this was not a passive blockade waiting for starvation. Ivar identified the fortress's one critical weakness, its water supply. He orchestrated a 4-month-long strangulation of the citadel, eventually managing to cut off or somehow dry up their well. Imagine the growing horror inside that rock fortress, the most heavily fortified position in Scotland, considered invincible, brought to its knees not by glorious combat, but by simple, agonizing thirst. Warriors watching their families die of dehydration. The defenders finally surrendered. The result was one of the largest single looting operations in Viking history. The annals describe the return of Ivar and Olaf to Dublin in 871 in terms that are genuinely staggering. They didn't come back with a few chests of gold and silver. They arrived with a fleet of 200 ships, 200 longships. And those ships were weighed down not with treasure or cattle, but with a massive cargo of Angles, Britons and Picts, thousands upon thousands of enslaved people. Ivar had effectively liquidated the population of an entire Scottish kingdom and brought them to Dublin's slave markets to be sold like cattle to the highest bidders. He was now proclaimed the undisputed king of the Norsemen, of all Ireland and Britain, a title that appears in multiple sources. He had conquered York. He had beheaded the king of Northumbria. He had executed the king of East Anglia. He had broken the supposedly impregnable Dumbarton Rock. He controlled the Irish Sea completely. At this moment, in 871, Ivar the Boneless was arguably the most successful and feared warlord in the Western world. He had overcome a severe physical disability to bend entire nations to his will. He had accumulated wealth, power, and a reputation that would terrify generations. But biology is a cruel, implacable master. Just as he reached the absolute zenith of his power and influence, the body that he had pushed beyond its limits for 50 years was finally beginning to give out. The boneless condition, whatever it truly was that he had fought against with such ferocious willpower, was about to claim its final victory. The monster was mortal after all. In the year 873, the annals of Ulster record a death that is as cryptic as it is historically significant. The entry reads simply, matter-of-factly Eamar, king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain, ended his life But it is the next phrase that catches the eye of both historians and medical pathologists. It says he died of a sudden, hideous disease swanamnes in Old Irish. For a man who had spent his entire adult life courting death on the battlefield, who had stood or sat amidst the shield walls of York and the slaughter of East Anglia, it is deeply ironic that he was not felled by a Saxon sword or a Scottish spear. He was taken from within by his own body. What was this hideous disease that killed him? If we accept the theory that Ivar suffered from osteogenesis imperfecta, his end was likely terrifyingly painful, but medically predictable. People with severe forms of this genetic condition often suffer from cardiac failure or respiratory complications as the rib cage progressively deforms and presses against the lungs and heart. His body, which had been simultaneously his prison and his weapon for 50 years, finally collapsed. The boneless warlord simply broke internally. But where is he buried? Where was the most feared man of the 9th century laid to rest? This brings us back to England, to a quiet parish church in Repton, Derbyshire. In the 1980s, archaeologists Martin Biddle and Bertha Kilby-Biddle uncovered something that looked less like a churchyard and more like a crime scene from an ancient massacre. Beneath a shallow mound in the vicarage garden, they found a mass grave containing the commingled remains of at least 264 people. Carbon dating placed these bones squarely in the late 9th century, the exact time the Great Heathen Army wintered in Repton. These were Ivar's men. The bones showed signs of violent trauma, but they had been stacked neatly, almost reverently, around a central chamber. In the center of this organized chaos, separate from the mass grave, lay a single, prominent burial labeled Grave 511. The man in Grave 511 was clearly a warrior of immense status. He was buried with a sword by his side, a rare honor. Around his neck hung a Thor's hammer amulet. But the most telling, symbolic detail, a boar's tusk, was placed between his legs. In Norse mythology, the boar is a symbol of fertility and masculine strength, perhaps a final symbolic compensation for a man who, if the legends are true, could not function sexually or physically like other men. The skeleton itself tells a confusing, contradictory story. This man was tall, around 6 feet, which was genuinely giant for the time. He was robust, heavily built. He had died from a horrific blow to the skull and a cut to the femoral artery. On the surface, he looks nothing like the boneless of the sagas. He looks like a berserker, a warrior. This creates fascinating historical friction and debate. Is Grave 511 actually Ivar? Some historians argue, yes. They suggest that boneless was never a medical diagnosis, but a mistranslation, or an ironic nickname for a man who was exceptionally agile, or perhaps legless, meaning constantly drunk, or even a corruption of the Latin exosus, meaning the detested one. They argue the sagas invented the dramatic disability centuries later to make the story more memorable. However, other scholars point to the sheer specific cruelty of the saga descriptions. Why would storytellers invent a disability that makes a hero seem weak unless it was a defining, unforgettable truth? There is another possibility worth considering. The annals say Ivar died in Dublin, but the sagas say he asked to be buried in England to magically protect it from invasion. Could his body have been moved after death, or is the man in Repton merely a high-ranking lieutenant, perhaps his brother Ubba, or a powerful jarl while Ivar lies elsewhere, lost to the peat bogs of Ireland. We may never know for absolute certain if the bones in Derbyshire belong to the mastermind of the Great Heathen Army. But standing in that crypt today, looking at the mass of fractured skulls and the prominent warrior of grave 511, you feel the tangible weight of his legacy. Whether he was a cripple or a giant, disabled or able-bodied, he commanded the absolute loyalty of hundreds of professional warriors who were willing to die and be buried at his feet. He was a magnet for death and loyalty. And when he died, he left a power vacuum. The brain of the Viking invasion was gone. The strategic unity of the Great Heathen Army died with him. What followed was the predictable fragmentation of Viking forces, giving the desperate Anglo-Saxons their first glimmer of genuine hope. A hope that would be seized by a young, sickly prince hiding in the marshes of Somerset, a man who would become the only English monarch ever to be called the Great. When a hurricane dissipates, the winds die down, but the landscape is left permanently altered, reshaped. That was the state of Britain after the death of Ivar the Boneless in 873. For nearly a decade, Ivar had been the gravity holding the Great Heathen Army together. He was the unifying force that bound distinct, often quarreling Viking chieftains and tribal groups into a singular spear tip pointed at England's heart. When that gravity vanished with his death, the army did what all leaderless coalitions inevitably do. It fractured. The Great Heathen Army split in two. One half, led by Ivar's brother Halfdan, went north to Northumbria. But they didn't go there to continue raiding. In a move that signaled the end of an era, they literally beat their swords into plowshares. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that Halfdan shared out the land of the Northumbrians, and they proceeded to plow and to support themselves. The wolves had become farmers. They settled down permanently, married local women, and began the slow, inevitable process of becoming Englishmen. The other half of the army, however, was not ready to retire from warfare. Led by a warlord named Guthrum, they turned their hungry eyes toward the only Anglo-Saxon kingdom left standing independently, Wessex. Wessex was the last domino. If it fell, the conquest of Britain would be complete and permanent. The language you speak today might be a dialect of Danish rather than English, and the man standing in the way of this final annihilation was a young, chronically sickly intellectual named Alfred. History would call him Alfred the Great, the only English monarch to earn that title. But in 871, he looked like Alfred the Doomed. He had just inherited the crown after his brother Ethelred died fighting the Vikings. His army was exhausted. His treasury was empty, and he was facing Guthrum, a disciple of Ivar who had learned the master's tactical lessons well. In January 878, Guthrum pulled a maneuver straight out of Ivar's strategic playbook. He launched a surprise winter attack on Alfred's court at Chippenham during the religious festival of Twelfth Night. Just like Ivar's famous attack on York during All Saints' Day, it was a strike calculated to exploit a moment of religious vulnerability when defenses were relaxed. Alfred barely escaped with his life. He fled into the Somerset levels, a vast, miserable swamp of marshes and peat bogs. For months, the King of Wessex lived like a hunted fugitive in his own country, hiding in the reeds, dependent on the charity of peasants who didn't recognize him. This should have been the end of his story. This is where most tales of defeated kings stop. The king dies in the mud, and the invaders win. But something remarkable happened in that swamp. Alfred didn't just hide and survive, he thought. Analyzed. Planned. He studied the enemy's tactics. He realized that the Anglo-Saxon military model, slow, reactive, based on local levies, was completely obsolete against the speed and ferocity of Viking warfare. Alfred began to fundamentally reform English military doctrine. He realized that to defeat the Vikings, he had to become more like them, more mobile, more professional. He built navy ships specifically designed to fight the dragon boats on their own terms at sea. He reorganized the army so that half the men were always on active duty, while the other half farmed, creating a standing force that could respond instantly to raids. And most importantly, he began building burhs, a network of fortified towns, positioned strategically so that no village in Wessex was more than 20 miles from a defensible stronghold. This was the Burghall system, a defensive grid designed to neutralize the Vikings' greatest advantage, mobility. Ivar's strategy had always relied on moving fast and striking undefended targets. Alfred's strategy ensured there were no undefended targets. In the spring of 878, Alfred emerged from the swamp like a ghost. He rode to Egbert's Stone and blew his war horn. The men of Wiltshire, Somerset, and Hampshire answered the call. They met Guthrum's army at Edington. The Battle of Edington was a brutal shield wall collision that lasted for hours. But this time, the Saxons didn't break under pressure. They held firm, and then they pushed forward. Alfred defeated Guthrum decisively and pursued him back to his fortress, besieging him until he surrendered. But Alfred, ever the student of history and politics, knew that simply killing a Viking leader often just created a martyr and brought fresh vengeance from overseas. So he did something strategically smarter. He converted him. As part of the peace treaty, Guthrum was baptized as a Christian, with Alfred standing as his godfather, a symbolic adoption. It was brilliant political theater. By making Guthrum a Christian king, Alfred brought him into the fold of civilized diplomacy. They divided England between them. The south and west belonged to Alfred. The north and east, the lands Ivar had conquered, became the Danelaw. The Danelaw was exactly what it sounds like, a state within a state, where Danish law, not Saxon law, prevailed. It was Ivar's legacy solidified permanently on the map. Yet by containing the Vikings there, Alfred saved the very concept of England from extinction. There's a strange historical irony here. Ivar the Boneless, the monster who wanted to destroy the English kingdoms, actually inadvertently saved them by shattering the petty rivalries of the Heptarchy, by systematically destroying Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. He cleared the political board. He forced the survivors to unite behind the only alternative left standing, Wessex. Ivar was the fire that burned down the old forest of competing kingdoms, allowing the single strong oak of unified England to grow in its place. Without the Great Heathen Army's destruction, there is no Alfred the Great. Without the monster, there is no nation. Let's talk about contemporary parallels, because Ivar's story teaches lessons that echo through every era. Think about disability and leadership. Ivar couldn't walk, but commanded armies. Modern FDR wheelchair led through the Second World War. Hawking paralyzed, revolutionized physics. Physical limitation doesn't mean mental incapacity. Think about overcoming through intelligence. Couldn't be strongest, became smartest. Modern every underdog story. Tech founders versus big corporations. Intelligence beats strength. Think about psychological warfare. Blood eagle, real or not, terrified enemies. Modern shock and awe. Atomic bombs ended the Second World War, partly through terror. Fear as weapon. Think about strategic patience. Waited years for revenge. Organized massive force. Modern, long-term planning. Chinese strategic patience. Building capabilities before striking. Think about logistics innovation. Demanded horses. Made Vikings cavalry. Modern every military innovation. Tanks. Helicopters. Drones. Mobility multiplies force. Think about intelligence networks. New Northumbria had civil war. Modern reconnaissance. Surveillance. Wars won by intelligence before battles. Think about timing attacks. Struck on holy days when distracted. Modern surprise attacks. Pearl Harbor. Yom Kippur War. Exploiting vulnerability moments. Think about puppet governments. Installed Egbert in Northumbria. Modern every client regime. Vietnam. Afghanistan. Controlling through proxies. Think about economic warfare. Built slave trade empire. Modern sanctions. Blockades. Economic pressure as weapon. Think about siege tactics. Cut off Dumbarton's water. Modern every siege. Sarajevo. Leningrad. Denying resources breaks resistance. Think about mass deportation. 200 ships of slaves. Modern ethnic cleansing. Population transfer. Forced relocation as strategy. Think about personal vendetta driving policy. Aya's death motivated invasion. Modern revenge in warfare. Bin Laden and post 9/11. Personal becomes political. Think about fragmentation after leader death. Army split when Ivar died. Modern every movement after charismatic leader. ISIS after Baghdadi. Leadership succession matters. Think about settler colonialism. Vikings became farmers. Modern every settlement. Israeli settlements manifest destiny. Invaders become inhabitants. Think about cultural conversion. Guthrum baptized. Modern every cultural assimilation. Forcing religion, language, culture unconquered. Think about divided nations. Danelaw versus Wessex. Modern every partition. Korea, Vietnam, Germany. Divided countries from war. Think about reforming to counter enemy. Alfred copied Viking tactics. Modern learning from enemies. U.S. counterinsurgency learning from insurgents. Think about fortification networks. Alfred Spurs. Modern every defensive network. Maginot Line. Iron Dome. Defensive grids. Think about standing armies. Alfred created professional force. Modern volunteer military. Professional versus conscript advantages. Think about naval power. Alfred built fleet. Modern every naval arms race. Carriers. Submarines. Controlling seas crucial. Think about political theater. Guthrum's baptism symbolic. Modern every propaganda event. Surrenders. Peace signings. Symbolism matters. Think about legacy versus intention. Ivar destroyed but unified England. Modern unintended consequences. Vietnam unified after the United States left. Blowback. Think about the disabled warrior. Carried into battle. Modern technology enables. Wounded warriors continue service. Prosthetics. Adaptations. Think about family dynamics. Brothers deferred to disabled sibling. Modern meritocracy in families. Intelligence valued over physical. Think about chronic pain and cruelty. Pain may have driven cruelty. Modern trauma creates trauma. Abused become abusers. Cycle of violence. Think about medical mysteries. Boneless meaning debated. Modern historical diagnosis. Analyzing historical figures medically. Think about nickname power. Boneless became terror title. Modern, every feared nickname. Stormin Norman. Mad dog. Names carry weight. Think about execution methods. Blood eagle torture. Modern death penalty methods. Guillotine. Electric chair. Lethal injection. How we kill reflects culture. Think about martyrdom. Edmund became saint. Modern every martyr. Died for faith becomes symbol. Deaths inspire movements. Think about archaeological evidence. Grave 511. Mystery. Modern forensics. Duna. Science answers history questions. Think about oral tradition accuracy. Sagas written centuries later. Modern how accurate are oral histories. Memory versus truth. Think about translation errors. Boneless, possibly mistranslated. Modern lost in translation. Language shapes understanding. Think about the monster versus hero. Villain to English. Hero to Vikings. Modern perspective matters. Terrorist versus freedom fighter. Every conflict has two sides. Think about the great man theory. Did Ivar change history, or was he product of forces? Modern leaders versus circumstances. Do individuals matter, or systems? Think about conquest justification. Avenging father. Modern every war needs justification. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Gulf of Tonkin. Casus belli manufactured. Think about the assimilation timeline. Vikings became English in generations. Modern immigrant assimilation. How long to adopt new culture? Think about the DNA legacy. Scandinavian genes in Britain today. Modern every conquest leaves genetic trace. Mongol DNA across Asia. Think about the linguistic legacy. English place names from Vikings. Modern language shows conquest. Spanish in the Americas. French in Africa. Think about the cultural mythology. Ivar in modern TV shows. Modern historical figures become entertainment. Vikings, Rome, Game of Thrones. Think about the disability representation. Rarely see disabled conquerors. Modern disability in media. Representation matters. Think about the prophecy fulfillment. Mother's warning came true. Modern self-fulfilling prophecies. Expectations shape outcomes. Think about the strategic withdrawal. Left England for Ireland. Modern knowing when to pivot. Changing theaters when opportunities better. Think about the slave trade. Vikings commercialized human trafficking. Modern every slave trade. Atlantic. Modern trafficking. Evil continues in new forms. Think about the fortification archaeology. Mass grave at Repton. Modern battlefield archaeology. Physical evidence of history. Think about the superstition power. William burned bones 200 years later. Modern symbolic acts matter. Destroying statues, burning flags. Think about the incomplete records. Chronicles stopped mentioning Ivar. Modern historical gaps. What we don't know about history. Think about the religious conflict. Pagan versus Christian. Modern every religious war. Still fighting over beliefs. Think about the civilian suffering. Villages burned. Populations enslaved. Modern war's civilian cost. Every conflict. Refugees. Deaths. Think about the berserker stereotype. Vikings, more than savages. Modern every cultural stereotype wrong. Reducing people to caricatures. Think about the climate influence. Migrations partly driven by resources. Modern climate refugees. Environment drives conflict. Think about the ship technology. Longships enabled expansion. Modern every technological enabler. Ships, planes, missiles. Tech enables conquest. Think about the raid economics. Monasteries had wealth. Modern targeting valuable sites. Banks, infrastructure, strategic targeting. So what's the final lesson of Ivar the Boneless? It's this. Your greatest weakness can become your greatest strength if you refuse to accept limitations. Ivar couldn't walk, so he learned to see the entire battlefield from above. He couldn't fight with his body, so he weaponized his mind. He turned disability into a symbol of power, the king who never needed to stand because his enemies were already kneeling. Ivar teaches us about the dark side of the underdog narrative. We love stories about people overcoming adversity. But Ivar reminds us that not all underdogs become heroes. Some become monsters. Some learn that in a cruel world, you survive by being the cruelest thing in it. Ivar teaches us about fear as currency. Physical strength fades. Wealth can be stolen. But fear is a currency that never loses its value. The blood eagle may not have been real, but the terror of it was real enough to break kingdoms. Ivar teaches us about unintended consequences. He wanted to destroy England. Instead, he unified it by eliminating all alternatives. He wanted revenge. Instead, he created the conditions for English nationalism. Ivar teaches us about leadership beyond physical presence. Carried into battle, He commanded loyalty. Modern warfare is increasingly remote drones, cyber. Physical presence matters less than strategic vision. Ivar teaches us about the power of intelligence. In a world of warriors, the strategist was king. Every military values intelligence over brute force. Planners matter more than fighters. Ivar teaches us about psychological projection. Chronic pain may have driven his cruelty. Trauma creates trauma. Hurt people hurt people. Breaking the cycle requires recognizing it. Ivar teaches us about legacy versus intention. He's remembered 1,200 years later, not for what he intended, but for what he accidentally created. History judges results, not intentions. Ivar teaches us about disability challenging assumptions. Viking society should have killed him. Instead, they recognized value beyond physical utility. Question assumptions about capability. Ivar teaches us about the incomplete historical record. We don't know if he was truly disabled or if boneless meant something else. History is interpretation, not fact. Ivar teaches us about cultural collision. Pagan Vikings versus Christian Saxons created unique hybrid culture. Every cultural meeting creates something new. Ivar teaches us about the settlement timeline. Vikings went from raiders to farmers in one generation. Conquerors become natives. Americans were once British colonists. Ivar teaches us about the archaeology of violence. Mass graves tell stories. Physical evidence matters. Bones don't lie, even when chronicles do. Ivar teaches us about superstition's power. William feared dead bones. Belief shapes action, regardless of truth. Perception is reality. Ivar teaches us that monsters are made, not born. Born with disability, raised in violent culture, driven by pain and ambition, circumstances create people. The defenders of England, the Anglo-Saxons who died fighting Ivar, were defending their homes, their families, their culture. Critics ask, was Ivar a brilliant leader or a sadistic monster both? Hero to Vikings, villain to English. History isn't simple good versus evil. What we know, Ivar the Boneless overcame a disability that should have killed him. He commanded armies from a stretcher. He broke kingdoms without walking. He proved that the most dangerous weapon isn't the axe in your hand, but the mind in your head. If this exploration taught you something, subscribe to Maproom Battles. Comment, do you think the Blood Eagle was real? Thanks for studying history's most controversial figures. Remember, your limitations are only as real as you believe them to be. Learn from Ivar.